Okay, good morning, everybody. Yeah, I guess just a quick introduction. I'm Bob Golding. I've worked at Phothera, formerly the Davlin side of the business, for 17 years, actually. So I've been around phototherapy for a really long time. Today, we're going to just generally talk about kind of some of the science and stuff behind phototherapy. I think there'll be a future meeting where we actually do some discussion of dosing and protocols. Happy to take questions about them, though. I really only have probably half an hour of stuff I'm going to talk to. Absolutely happy to take questions. Put them in the chat, not the Q&A. That part's kind of confusing. The Teams has both.
Vice versa.
Or sorry, the Q&A, not the. Yes, follow Mr. Dosser's instructions on that. So anyway, we will get going. And Teams is thinking about showing my PowerPoint. Teams is still thinking about it. Okay. And do we have a slide? All right, cool. All right. So we kind of like giving a brief overview. I probably will go off book because that's just sort of the nature of me. We're going to talk about the history of phototherapy a little bit, how we've kind of evolved as to what we do, a little bit of basic science wrapped in that, um, some of how it affects various diseases. Happy to talk about that later, and just a little bit about kind of myths and misconceptions. But I really hope this is fairly interactive because honestly, it's going to be boring for me if we don't actually have some questions and feedback. So let's go from there. So, phototherapy has been in various shapes and forms around kind of somewhat forever. I mean, you can talk about people going to the Dead Sea and soaking in salt and being exposed to sunlight, but in terms of it being part of the Western medical armamentarium, it really starts about 100 years ago. Actually, the first Nobel Prize in medicine is somewhat related to it. So this is kind of a quick overview. There's a lot of stuff that should be filled in that is not on this, but if we think about what we do in phototherapy, this realistically started with coal tar becoming relatively common, right? And this is you know, it's something that it's a byproduct or an offshoot of the rise of the chemical industry. Many people know, I guess, if you paid attention maybe in college chemistry, that the German chemical conglomerates, of what we think of as BASF, IG Farben, those guys had a pretty much infinite soft coal. So they started making dyes from it. They wound up with leftover products from that, including, among other things, coal tar that could be used medically. Also, you had a little bit of the same thing happening in the US around the same time, the rise of the petroleum industry. You wound up with Vaseline and mineral oil as unwanted products. Because if you think about the original start of the petroleum industry, kerosene was the desired product as a cheaper replacement for whale oil. Everything else was kind of useless. Gasoline was totally useless. Nobody wanted it because it's too explosive for a very long time. So you have coal tar. Coal tar as a monotherapy works. You can still get, the shampoos that have, T-gel type shampoos that have it. It is somewhat a photosensitizer, and we have Mayo Clinic roll out Geckerman regime using coal tar. And when we say broadband UVB, in this sense, it was not fluorescent UVB. This was arc lamp stuff, so even broader than broadband as it's used medically. Then you do see the introduction, I guess, of some parts of Yeah, sorry about that. Brief technical problem there. We'll just screen share and get back as fast as we can to what we were doing. Okay, so anyway, uh, in the 1970s, we start seeing some pretty quick advancements in dermatology. You start seeing cyclosporin and methotrexate get discovered and go through clinical trials, methotrexate in particular, and then psoralen, which originally were derived from plants in Egypt for the treatment of vitiligo with solar light. Um, Started trials in a methodical way. And this is the 16 center PUVA trial, if you're familiar with that, done by Elder Pharmaceutical. Eventual FDA approval in 1982. Absolutely a game changer there. Around the same time, broadband UVB fluorescent lamps were available. People started using them a little bit medically. And it was known right from the beginning that some part of that spectrum wasn't all that important. We had some very decent um, basic science done in the early 80s, mostly at Harvard, to select what part of that mattered. From that, you wind up with narrowband UVB. Now, although we can say that it entered practice in 1988, that was really limited. It's mostly Dr. Ferguson in Scotland. It's pretty much limited to Europe at that point. It's about 10 years later that we actually see the rise of it in the United States. That was actually a Phothera commercialization to bring that to the United States in a meaningful way. Before that, we were more a PUVA and broadband company. And then, kind of over the space of about 5 to 10 years, you get the rise of narrowband, where it basically replaces broadband. It almost does everything better, except some very rare situations involving itch, where the UVA component of broadband UVB is useful. And then probably the next major development, just to keep this all in one trial, is that we're very proud of this fact at the moment that in 2019 we started enrolling patients in the LIGHT trial, which in some ways is probably the biggest narrowband trial ever done in psoriasis. It also has the benefit of that it had both home and clinical arms and showed safety in both. Let's talk about the back end science of how this works. This is kind of the meat of the talk. So this is mostly refresher for most people. This is the electromagnetic spectrum. There are a couple things to point out in this. One, when we look at it, uh, UV below 200 nanometers does not actually pass through the atmosphere through air very well at all. UVC, which is 200 to 280, actually does pass through air reasonably well. That's why we can use it as a disinfection technique in air purifiers. Like I have one in my own furnace at home. It's not a bad idea. And then once we get into UVB, 280 to 315 or 320. And the distinction there is that North America uses 320 as the split between UVB and UVA. The rest of the world, well, and in particular Europe, uses 315. Does not matter a ton medically to know this distinction. It's mostly important when you're looking at basic science type papers to know that it's common for the cutoff to have moved slightly. The other thing, and it's not on this slide, is long wave UV, UVA. 320 or 315 to 340 is UVA2, and 340 to 400 is UVA1. They have different biological properties, which we can get into a little bit. It's worth noting that in UVA, we consider 400 nanometers to be the split between UV and visible light, but it's not an absolute line. So the younger someone's eye is, the lens in their eye, the more they can see into what we think of as UV. Someone very young that has they can probably see down, to 385. Somebody that's older and the lens in their eye has aged in yellow, they might not even be able to see down to 420. So that split is somewhat arbitrary. Once you get into violet versus UVA1, it's not a hard and fast barrier, but we use 400 nanometers for it. Okay, so much more the meat of this thing. The yellow line is sunlight measured in Bryan, Ohio. We did it ourselves here. That's what the spectrum of sunlight generally looks like. So if you notice, the yellow line tapers off pretty quick once we get into UV. And it drops especially fast, actually, once you get down to about 330. If you notice, the curve steepens at that point. And when we get down to, say, 310, where we're very interested in this for psoriasis treatment, there's almost nothing. We're talking about a couple percent of the energy in sunlight. You have a ton of energy further up in UV, and sunlight actually peaks in green light as far as the amount of energy it's got. The other interesting thing on this slide to pay attention to, in my opinion, is the blue line is a broadband lamp, broadband fluorescent lamp. Technology was originally intended for paint aging in the 50s, in the early fluorescent era. It's serendipitous that it has medical uses, and there's a couple things to point out about it. One is it's not all that powerful, really. It's a broad peak, it tails off into UVA, and it tails off into UVC. And the human erythemal response, it peaks just below 300 nanometers. So all of that tail to the left of 300 nanometers is really, really erythemic. Now, it's good for creating vitamin D. The vitamin D spectrum is pretty close to human erythemal response. Not very useful in this case for phototherapy. Makes broadband dosing a little tricky too, just because it's so erythemal. You're talking about seconds, not minutes, in terms of danger. So the red line is a narrowband UVB lamp. So also known as a TLO1. If you're reading international literature, Phillips's code for the phosphor in the lamp is O1. In the US, we just usually refer to it as narrowband UVB. If you look at some very older publications, you might hear it called soft UVB. That's narrowband, and that's the majority of what we're doing. If you look at it, it has fairly minimal energy below 305. So not very much is erythemic about narrowband. Now, you can certainly get erythema with it, but it's a much more usable treatment, and it's got a larger therapeutic index in the sense that you don't have to be quite as close to an adverse event to get the treatment that you want. Okay, next question here, and this is, I don't imagine anybody on this call is going to have any misconceptions on it, but the green line is a tanning lamp. It's also known as a 350BL, and it's got a ton of energy, peaking at about 350, but in UVA2 and UVA1, and it's got fairly minimal energy down where this is useful for us in UVB, maybe 2.5%, 3%. So if we think of between 300 and 320, there's a sweet spot for pretty much everything we want to do. Tanning lamp is not the way to get it. You have a bunch of unwanted content. There's definitely a concept that melanoma induction relates to energy around 340 nanometer. Now, that's poorly understood, but this is probably one of the reasons that indoor tanning users, especially with a significant history of burns and a long time doing it, absolutely have an increased melanoma risk. Narrowband is not over there. So a couple things are going on here that are worth noting. One, using a tanning lamp is not a good medical idea. Two, using a tanning lamp medically, although you may be able to get some treatment, you're going to get a whole bunch of other things you don't want, including the induction of MMPs that are essentially collagenase around 340. So you're going to have significant wrinkling potential and then photoaging. And the other thing about this to note is, since the peak of a tanning lamp is so far shifted to the right on the graph, it's not very erythemal. I mean, you talk about people being able to take, 5-10 joules worth of this energy, over the course of 5-10 minutes, 20 minutes even, without being burned or having erythema. So a somewhat common mistake that, an uneducated patient, a patient that buys a used machine and doesn't know what they're doing, is, well, I was up to 10 minutes in a tanning booth. I'll start at 5 minutes with narrowband UVB, and it will burn them every single time. It is far more erythemal than what they think it is. And I'd like to just point out real quickly about fluorescent lamps that they all look white when they're off. You can't tell what they are unless you read the label. And then the other part of it is, when they're on, all UV lamps look the same. If you look at this graph, you can see mercury lines. There's one at about 365, a little bump. in all the curves, in the green curve, the red curve, and the blue curve. There's another one of those at 405, and there's another one at 417-ish, and we perceive that as a light blue glow. All phototherapy lamps look the same. I took our service techs years ago, and I blocked their ability to tell what the label on the lamp was and what the ends looked like to see the aging of the lamp. None of them could tell what the power output of a lamp was and what type it was. So this is one of the reasons that metering and dosimetry is quite important. I think we're going to get into that in the next webinar. But if you look at this, all three of the lamps on that screen are going to look exactly the same in use, and you have no idea. Plus, a number of other UV lamps are going to look the same too, including reptile lamps, which are sort of a mix of broadband and UVA. Now, this is a concept that, this is just another lamp curve I want to discuss real briefly, that just in the same way that narrowband UVB and broadband UVB are distinct, UVA1 and PUVA lamps are distinct. So that blue curve, very similar to a tanning lamp, is the lamp that we use to activate Sorlin. Sorlin's activation peak is around 335. If you look at the red curve, that's a UVA1 fluorescent lamp that you would use as a monotherapy, perhaps in something like graft versus host or scleroderma. So UVA lamps are not all identical. I've actually seen this in the field internationally where a PUVA machine was lamped with UVA1 lamps, and they obviously were getting almost no effect because there's almost no energy where they need it. So lamps are different. Can't tell them apart by the eye. You need a good meter. You need to talk to somebody that knows what they're doing. This is where frequently patients, home patients, will buy a machine not understanding any of these differences and assume everything's the same. Phototherapy in use. So just want to talk just a little bit to mechanisms, right? So mechanisms, there's probably more than one that is relevant in psoriasis and dermatitis. We definitely see shifts in IL-17 and IL-23 pathways. Honestly, if you had to sum up of all of why narrowband works, it essentially changes the expression of inflammatory and anti-inflammatory cytokines. Now, there are a bunch of other things going on. Like, sure, your vitamin D status will improve to normal range if it's insufficient. Is that a primary mechanism of action? No, we know it's not, right? And vitamin D status alone isn't really a huge thing. Transuranic acid, UCA, I want to talk about just for a second, is that it's fairly common when a patient undergoes phototherapy that they notice a smell coming off their skin immediately after that. That's UCA that's been isomerized by the light. It actually has an immunomodulatory effect, so it probably contributes a little bit. You do have direct induction of dimers, and you have some direct and indirect T cell death too. So there's probably a number of them, but it's mostly cytokine related and balancing cytokines. The other thing when we talk about like mechanisms, and it's more relevant for dermatitis, I didn't bother to put it on the slide. Exposure to narrowband UVB upregulates antimicrobial peptides in the skin. So many atopic dermatitis patients are colonized with some amount of pathogenic bacteria. And this is the whole theory behind doing, bleach soaks and probably a number of other modalities of treating dermatitis. Well, upregulating the amount of antimicrobial peptides in the skin certainly doesn't hurt. And you can see some changes in the overall ratios of what bacteria are on the skin after narrowband exposure. So another point to bring up here, and I'll save some discussion of maintenance therapy, I guess, for either the questions or later, is that when you clear someone that has psoriasis with narrowband UVB, there is some amount of remission. We don't really see that much with broadband UVB. It's one of the advantages of it. And there's a really nice study that where they actually measured baseline PASI, treated to clearance over 30 treatments, and then stopped therapy and assessed the patient once a month. And in that particular subset of patients, it took 14 months. Published elsewhere is 9 months. So a lot of psoriasis patients will see some amount of sustained remission. Not all of them, right? Some of them have very active disease and maybe are a candidate for maintenance therapy. Maintenance therapy is a topic that I personally feel is uh, there's not a hard right or wrong answer on it, but it's worth noting that some patients do have really sustained remissions. Okay, this is kind of an overview slide of a bunch of stuff, and I'm just going to talk about who and why and when on phototherapy. So, Phothera's indications for use with the FDA are by and large encompasses specifically pediatric to geriatric patients, and it also covers psoriasis, vitiligo, and eczema as non-exclusive. Basically, any skin condition that requires ultraviolet therapy at the judgment of a prescribing physician, we're indicated for, which is kind of nice. It's actually quite broad. The other thing is, you might ask, like, well, who is not a phototherapy patient? People with active skin cancer, people possibly with a history of skin cancer if they're bad at follow-up. This gets a little gray, especially in an elderly patient where they had two basal cells removed 5 years ago. There's multiple different guidelines on that, but skin cancer is certainly one of them. Uh, Patients with photosensitive lupus are not candidates for UVB therapy. They are in actually quite improved by UVA1. So in some ways, that's a modality specific part of this. And the other one is anyone that's had phototherapy and they reacted awfully badly for it, right? And maybe they had undiagnosed lupus, maybe they have some photosensitizing things going on. Photosensitizers are weird with UVB. Very few things really are. Most things that are on the photosensitizing list really are photosensitizers to sunlight. So unfortunately, the FDA hasn't updated their photosensitizing drug list in 20 plus years. We have classes of drugs that rarely cause any problem in narrowband. I mean, this is something that fairly common that uh, people will be really, really worried about tetracycline or doxy, and it's not much of a problem in narrowband. It's a huge problem in sunlight, huge problem in UVA. The other part of this is that when we say pediatric and geriatric patients, this is also depending on, I guess I'm going to say, social factors beyond the disease state, right? So children are often very apprehensive to go in a full body phototherapy machine. There is an ability to leave the door open if needed for the first few treatments so they can be right next to their caregiver. Elderly patients, kind of the same thing. Can they stand that long? So forth. We get a lot of phone calls about the elderly, less about children. And in the elderly ones, usually the concerns are things like they have a pacemaker. Well, if we go back to the slide about the electromagnetic spectrum, the UV from the lamp is not going to affect their pacemaker. It's actually not going to affect an implantable, pretty much anything, people with a PICC line, so forth. That's not really an issue. Like, it doesn't penetrate that far. And I would like to focus a little bit on this in conjunction with other modalities. We spend a lot of time thinking about this and doing this. So pretty much everything combines decent or great with phototherapy. And there's papers out there you can find on this. It's hard for me to pick a specific one, but almost everybody starts psoriasis patients with a topical steroid of some level of potency, usually somewhere in the medium level. And you don't have to discontinue that. They work together. They're synergistic in effect, but they don't increase photosensitivity in a meaningful way. Retinoids combine really well. They do increase photosensitivity, so you want to drop your doses by about a third in that situation. Uh, Pretty much most of the classes of biologic and systemic drugs have been combined in various ways. I mean, cyclosporin and narrowband, there's a short course of cyclosporin and then going to narrowband. Same thing with methotrexate. Same thing with your anti-TNF biologics. There's actually some decent work on that. It sort of improves the clearance rate for what I would think of as an older biologic on that. And then if we branch out a little bit into other topics, definitely the two biologics we have now in atopic dermatitis, They work very well with phototherapy. That's been done, that's published. Vitiligo, virtually every vitiligo treatment either doesn't work for a subset of patients without phototherapy, or it works way better. So, I mean, to steal from people that are heavy vitiligo practitioners, basically everybody gets narrowband as fast as they can get it in vitiligo. Okay, just this is a quick, fast one. Skin cancer is a arguable thing that I will tell a quick thing that I've been here for 17 years, and I personally know of every single adverse event that we've ever had to report to the FDA, and I certainly know about all of them in the last few years, in the last 17. I know of one call that we've gotten where it was cleanly a phototherapy skin cancer issue, and it was a very wealthy gentleman that had tried PUVA in the 80s and then spent the subsequent 25 years doing PUVA twice a week and had not seen a dermatologist. His general practitioner doing concierge medicine scripted him the oxorolin, and he just kept treating endlessly. So yes, obviously he got melanoma and squamous cell. Usually in PUVA, we think of about 250 treatments with oral PUVA where the risk starts. Bath or topical PUVA doesn't show the same risks, but in any case, the only one that I've ever actually seen. Now, we have some good data out of Scotland, which is cited in this thing, that has got fairly long-term follow-up, did not show any melanoma and any squamous cell, and was statistically indecisive about basal cell on 5,800 patients. There's some newer data that is pretty complementary to it from Germany and South Korea and Taiwan. Very little in the US as far as good long-term follow-up data on it. In some ways, US population is not great for this sort of thing. And also patients don't remember whether they had PUVA, broadband, narrowband, Grenz rays. That's a funny one that we've seen people that had Grenz ray therapy for psoriasis and they thought it was phototherapy, which it's not. It's basically soft X-rays. Um, Phototherapy isn't like tanning and sun exposure. And this is a tough one in practice, right? You want to tell people about, photo protection, you want to talk about sunscreen, but here, hop in this thing that looks like a tanning bed. And this is something that the slides that show the difference in the spectrum are pretty clear. Like the difference between a tanning lamp and narrowband, you can't see it with your eye, but it's a bigger difference in terms of nanometers than basically any visible light color that you could relate to another color. Um, Home phototherapy, not as effective, or it has a worse safety profile than in office. That is not actually an issue right now. I would argue that with guided mode on a ClearLink controller, since it automatically does decreases based on mistreatments, that's actually better than by default the equipment in a dermatologist's office is. There, it's got to be a manual intervention to remember this. So when we look at the light trial data, there's not a downside to doing home phototherapy over in office. If anything, like I said, controller specific, it probably has more safety features baked into it. Outdated compared to biologics we've already kind of addressed this a little bit. The IL-17A and F inhibitors are very, very effective and certainly have very, very good clearance rates. They're also incredibly expensive. And this is if you look at any kind of healthcare economics argument, basically everybody should start with narrowband phototherapy unless the patient is counterindicated for it. And then more exposure means better results. That is always a problem that the patient's like, well, you said to do this 3 times a week. I'm going to do it every single day, or I'm going to, double the doses or whatever. We can avoid a great deal of that with the controller technology at the moment, but it's still worth knowing that, one of the more interesting commercial partners of ours, and thankfully they've published this, is Kaiser Permanente, and they start all phototherapy patients at a very low dose. They probably get effectively about 200 millijoules, regardless of skin type, and they eventually ramp up and they have very good results. 2/3 of their patients don't go on to a biologic drug. So when we say more exposure means better results, even in darker skin types, Fitzpatrick 5 and 6, they're starting patients what we would think of as pretty low, but they catch up and it works. So at that point, I'm hoping people have some questions because I would like to answer them.
You have one up top. I've had a very difficult time finding Sorolin for my patients. Any idea of a national pharmacy that keeps this available?
Okay, yeah, a couple thoughts on that one. So if you look at the FDA website, you can actually look up all the generic manufacturers of 8-methoxylin. And at last I knew there were four. And they do come and go a little bit. And this is anecdotal. This is not like an absolute thing. But CVS's online pharmacy has worked really well for one of our customers in the last, say, 6 months. I probably talked to them in November about it, and their best luck was with them. Now, doesn't mean that that's always the case or anything like that. That's something that you're more than well, if you follow up with an email and we can think of anything more relevant, we'll be happy to do that too.
So CVS and the FDA database?
Yeah, the FDA Orange Book. Yeah, the Orange Book will tell you the makes of the stuff because once you know the manufacturers have websites, right? And they have contact numbers, so you can go at it from that direction as well. Oh, and I would be remiss to not mention this, that the FDA about 10 years ago came out with very strict directives that when a licensed pharmaceutical drug or biologic product is used in combination with a medical device, the drug manufacturer controls all of the information and advice about that. So we absolutely are going to point you to the prescribing insert from the drug company or whatever when it comes to PUVA or PDT therapy, because we do PDT as well.
Fred wants to know what insurance / health plans or employers are you in network with?
I mean, this is a list that I certainly cannot rattle off the entirety of this thing. It's a good question for a commercial side. I mean, I believe we have contracts with something like 60 different payers. We also do a lot of it out of network. So that's not really my side of the business. I'm R&D or clinical science. I know, for one thing, we're always trying to expand it. Some of the big carriers have pretty good coverage. They all have slightly different rules too.
Okay, you answered that.
I can read them.
Yep.
Okay, CTCL. So a lot of people that have been around for a while know that in about 2010, there was a complete shortage of Sorolin. There were no generic manufacturers at that point. They weren't licensed. So you had basically one place to go to, and if Valiant wasn't making it, you were hosed. And they had a supply chain issue on their API to actually make it. When all of this happened, we searched for Sorolin. We absolutely did, but the entire market was out for basically a year, and there were a great deal of patients that were on maintenance therapy for CTCL and had been for a very long time. And the question is what to do about that. And and I guess I would say a great number of prescribers converted them all to narrowband. And at the time, conventional wisdom was that PUVA was far better than narrowband and CTCL. It actually worked quite well. So I would say that in CTCL, you absolutely can do a psoriasis type narrowband protocol. You can try the one thing that we never could figure out when we went through that year of this is any reasonably good math to take somebody that was getting, say, 2 joules and 60 milligrams of 8-Mapoxorolin and convert that to a narrowband dose, because it's oranges and apples. So all of them got restarted on narrowband well, I shouldn't say all. We never could figure out a dose walkover between the two. They're just different modalities of treatment, frankly. So my suggestion is if you're going to take somebody that's on maintenance CTCL, PUVA, and they've had maybe, say, 2 weeks or more, start them over as a fresh narrowband patient. Just use good dose increases, 10 to 20% dose increases. You'll catch them up to whatever photoadaptation they have relatively quickly. So it was an unintentional experiment. Frankly, it would have probably violated like the Helsinki Accord type stuff to have switched those CTCL patients over. but nobody had an option with no oral Sorlin in the North American market for about a year. They all got switched. Now, I still like Phototherapy for some stuff. I really like it for bath and soak therapy for severe palmar plantar disease, but it's still a good option. But if you have Sorlin availability problems, use narrowband instead. To my knowledge, over a couple hundred patients that were switched that we actually knew about, none of them CTCL actually flared up or got out of whatever stage it was in or did anything particularly bad on long-term narrowband maintenance instead.
Okay. Uh, this one, Terry again.
Or she, as well. Okay, no. I mean, this is a payer level thing, and um, depending on their insurance carrier, it is not a barrier that they have to have had office phototherapy. Now, it's of course our goal is to eliminate that as a barrier with everybody, and we're working on that, especially with the results of the light trial. But it is not an absolute issue. I mean, I would say my guess is of the major carriers' policies that I've personally looked at, which is probably about 50, less than half mandated successful in-office treatment. And the ones that did, it wasn't necessarily the same across diseases. You had some weird stuff where atopic dermatitis, they wanted to see it, or vitiligo, they wanted to see it, but psoriasis was fine, things like that. So it's not an absolute barrier, but it's payer by payer. And I would like to just quickly add that Medicare does not care at all. So Medicare is an example of one that, which is a fairly large payer, depending on your patient population, is not going to have in-office clinical phototherapy as a prerequisite before you can get a home device. Okay. When we receive a prescription, it depends incredibly on the payer. And once again, not my end of the business. We can refer you to people that can answer that by payer. Um, the back and forth with the insurance company can take months, right? So this varies. A cash pay patient that calls us up, if I called in tomorrow with a prescription and a credit card, the machine would ship probably the next day or within a day or two. If the payer makes us go through multiple rounds of appeals or whatever, this can drag out quite a bit longer. I can tell you that our goal is on anything that's a common SKU that we build out there. It's a matter of days. Like we actually try to keep stock of the most common configurations. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the bleach bath thing too because it's complementary to almost everything else. I think it's wildly underutilized in pediatric atopic dermatitis, personally.
I think that is it for right now. Unless you want to ask anyone if they have.
Okay, any final questions? And I think you guys probably will find the next one of these a little more, interesting because we're going to talk about protocols in a more serious way. Anything else? Going once?
We got one. How does phototherapy affect T cells?
It's probably almost all through some cytokine that we are in interaction. There's debate whether you can actually take a petri dish that just has T cells in it, irradiate it where you didn't have anything else and kill them. I believe you probably can to some extent. Um, just my theory on that. All right.
AAD, if they want to learn more, come find us at.
Yes, absolutely.
AAD is coming up shortly. If anyone has any further questions or would like to talk to Bob in person or any one of us about any of the topics, come find us at booth 2443.
2443. And also, I would like to point out if you're at Orlando early, the day before is the annual meeting of the Photodermatology Society. It's relatively cheap. I'd be happy to see you there because I'm a big fan of it. I'm on the board. It's probably the place for phototherapy nerds to congregate, and also sunscreen nerds. So if you're really into sunscreen, but definitely always some useful content there, always a good time. So yeah, consider the Photodermatology Society meeting. Its agenda is up on its website, I believe, as of yesterday. And definitely, if you were at AAD and walking around, stop by and talk to us.
And sign up for Dr. Raja's speak.
Yes, and we do have an industry speaker this year. This is a new experiment for Phothera. We're excited about it. So yeah, if you're free for that one, please also stop by. So
I'm putting details in the chat right now.
Yes, and big thanks for Mr. Doster, who has set these up, and he's actually adding dates, times, booth numbers, everything you need to know. I'm watching him type it right now.
I believe it's 12:45 to 1:30.
Yeah.
But we will be sending out this deck along with this presentation and all of the information after this in a few days. So
Yeah.
look for that as well.
You'll get a follow-up email that lists all three of the things we just talked about. Booth number, industry session, and photodermatology.
Perfect.
Cool. If nobody has anything else, hey, thanks for stopping by today and talking to us.
Thanks all.
Yep, thanks everybody. Bye.